In 2006, I was sitting at my desk at EA in Chertsey, scrolling through the news from the Tokyo Game Show coverage at my office, jealous I wasn't there on the floor, but thrilled that these trailers were finally making their way across the web. One clip in particular stopped me cold, a Level 5 trailer shown at TGS for what was then called White Knight Story, later White Knight Chronicles. The trailer promised a world where you and your comrades leapt into the fray, where massive armour transforms and giant knights clash, a spectacle that felt designed to sell the next generation of consoles, and the idea of JRPGs grown up and visceral. And Level 5, the developers behind Dark Cloud and Rogue Galaxy, seemed like the right people to do it. Forums lit up. One enthusiastic TGS reaction said,
"Simply stunning." And that transformation near the end of the trailer just makes you drool for more action.
And the footage itself, the cinematic transformation and the impression of coordinated combat among allies, looked, to many of us, like a promise about what future RPGs would become and do. However, the final release shattered the illusion. Reading the comments on this now 18-year-old video tell a very different story.
I totally feel cheated! The game I bought and the game in this trailer are not the same at all. What we got? Static sword slapping, a character creation so you can see yourself be ignored by the bland cast, and enemies with too much HP just to keep the game dragging on longer.
Sony duped us so bad with this trailer! LOL!
10 years later, and I still can't forget about this trailer. Of course, the end product looked and played nothing like that, but the trailer gave me the excitement of a next-gen JRPG that reinvented the genre.
19 years later, and I haven't forgotten about that trailer either. Of course, I played White Knight Chronicles when it came out and had the same realization that the trailer we all saw back in 2006 was probably faked. It was a nice concept video, but very little of it, if any, was playable, and I wouldn't have been surprised if the whole thing had been a render straight out of 3DS Max. But recently, I played Final Fantasy XVI, and a lot of the same beats that hooked me on White Knight early on were clear and present in this modern game. A lush, verdant landscape, exciting combat as a member of a small team of warriors, and playful, well-written dialogue that makes the characters come alive. It was like a long-promised déjà vu. It turns out that Final Fantasy XVI is the game White Knight Chronicles promised to be. Gameplay. In the case of White Knight Chronicles, combat mixed real-time attack input with cooldowns and command palettes. Transformations into the White Knight were visually striking, but many battles were criticised as being too easy or too repetitive. GameSpot said,
"The monsters may look interesting, but slaying beasts is way too easy in this forgettable role-playing game."
For Final Fantasy XVI, the design leans into fluid, responsive action. Every clash, dodge, and icon-linked special move feels tuned to deliver cinematic impact. GameSpot remarked that
FF16 is a bold shift in both gameplay and narrative, yet captures the Final Fantasy magic in stunning fashion.
in that first trailer, it felt like the strikes and blocks really connected, and I saw this happen during my playthrough of Final Fantasy XVI. Granted, general gameplay animations aren't physics correct, but there are numerous interactive cutscenes that are highly cinematic and add to the excitement. They have satisfying and punchy hits, and you can imagine that clang of sword on shield or the heat emanating from a giant fireball. Features. In White Knight Chronicles, one of the most interesting features was its multiplayer and online component. Your avatar could join quests with other players, there was a shared component, and the transformation into the White Knight was supposed to be a major showpiece. That online promise helped define its identity, but many reviewers noted that narrative and single-player pacing felt separate. Online missions sometimes felt tacked on or less polished. In Final Fantasy XVI, there is no multiplayer overlay. Every element, transformations, icon battles, boss scale, story moments, is crafted as part of the single-player arc. The pacing is more consistent. Spectacle and narrative are baked into the journey rather than added as optional side systems. While it seems like a step back in terms of scope, as a developer myself, I can attest to the wisdom of focusing your efforts. Tacked on and shallow features can detract from the main experience, and of course suck up development time, both in iteration and testing. story and tonal maturity. In White Knight Chronicles, the plot followed traditions: a young hero, ancient powers, a kidnapped figure, and moral clarity between good and evil. Critics found it somewhat predictable. GameSpot's review said,
Shallow combat and a predictable story make going through the main quest a slog.
In Final Fantasy XVI, the narrative embraces complexity: betrayal, political intrigue, sacrifice, moral compromise. Game Informer said,
It's less that everything happening outside of the main story is rote, but rather what Creative Business Unit 3 does in those story missions is so great that I constantly found myself rushing as best I could to the next one.
It was still a fantasy story and takes a little effort to engage your suspension of disbelief, but most of all, I found the characters likeable, so it was easy to follow them through the story plots. One standout moment for me was the pure primal rage on display when Clive finally confronts Kupka. They both have reason to be angry with each other, and that makes the clash even more powerful. As a player, it motivates you to go into that fight and hit the ground running, and dodging his blows only to strike back is one of the more satisfying things I've ever done in a video game. Final Fantasy XVI definitely got a bit of Game of Thrones influence, and this can be seen in its somewhat more gritty storytelling. They stop short of showing any full frontal nudity, keeping it tasteful instead, but they are not afraid to confront some more problematic topics like the lower status of bearers, treated like slaves, the illness that consumes them, violence, and the consequences of war. Voice acting and characters. In White Knight Chronicles, the English voice cast included several recognisable names. For instance, Crispin Freeman voiced Seti in Grazel, and Carrie Walgren voiced Princess Cisna in the International Edition. These are actors with significant credits in animation and other video games.
And now the knights are free again.
So it seems. The Dogma Age ended with no victor. However, the oracles of the time prophesied a final battle would be fought 10 millennia later.
However, multiple reviews criticised the voice acting. GameSpot said that the voice acting is
Downright silly, which makes even dramatic scenes laughable.
The sense is that while the cast had talent, direction, script and production made many performances feel underwhelming or tonally inconsistent.
But this will be your only chance to ever see the princess alive. Thank you, and do have a good day.
Bastard! I'd like to wring his neck.
By contrast, Final Fantasy XVI's voice acting has been broadly praised, especially the performance of Ben Starr as Clive Rosfield and Ralph Ensign as Sidolphus. For example, Game Critics writes that
Cutscene direction and English voice acting are top-notch, with every character fully formed.
And that Starr shows
Plenty of range in almost every scene.
But mostly I was afraid. Afraid to go back.
I'm a monster! And I deserve to die! So end it! End it now!
He's far from invincible. In fact, when we meet him, he's broken. He's completely destroyed. It was remarkable, actually, how much that resonated with me, and that sense of just needing a little bit of hope.
that attention to emotional nuance and a cast willing to carry heavy scenes tends to give Final Fantasy XVI's voice work a weight that many critics say elevates the narrative. Personally, I thought Ben Starr's performance as Clive was so good, it got me interested in Claire Obscure Expedition 33, where he voices Verso. Hearing that both he and Jennifer English were involved was enough to make me pick up that game without many more questions asked. Having said that, once you go off the beaten path in Final Fantasy, you do notice that not all the NPCs got the same level of treatment when it comes to their script and animations. A few interactions come off wooden, and it's possibly unavoidable in a game of this size, but it is noticeable when the bar is set so high early on in the main story-driven chapters.
I don't want to keep my companions waiting.
If you mean Sid and the girl, you needn't worry. They have yet to reach the checkpoint.
Sales. Sales for White Knight Chronicles were good for a new IP at the time. Several 100,000 copies sold in its launch territories. The game's development was handled by Level 5, a mid-sized studio that was building up its pipeline for online support, console-scale art assets and transformations, but didn't have the massive production budgets of later AAA titles. When Final Fantasy XVI launched, Square Enix reported over 3 million players had journeyed into the realms of Valisthea shortly after release. The Final Fantasy XVI development team grew large, in the hundreds, with multiple disciplines, combat design, narrative, cinematics, AI, polished for modern expectations. There is a traceable staff overlap. Yusuke Hashimoto, who was in Final Fantasy XVI's credits, is also listed as a design engineer at Level 5. He connects the two projects in a kind of personal lineage. So while the studios were different, and the eras distinctly different, people and ideas did travel across them. Critical reception. Metacritic shows White Knight Chronicles International Edition at around 64 out of 100, a mixed reception. Reviewers often celebrated its ambition and some of its visuals, but expressed disappointment in pacing, mechanical depth, and how some promises from early trailers didn't translate into sustained reward. Final Fantasy XVI launched to broadly positive reviews. Its Metacritic score edged into the high 80s, with outlets praising its combat, story tone, and cinematic production, while some noted side content or pace could lag in parts. I think in a way it's both a double-edged sword being part of the Final Fantasy franchise. It gave the game a massive boost in terms of visibility and justified massive investment in its development, but it will always be difficult to stand out next to the juggernaut that is Final Fantasy VII, which spans both classic gaming and modern with its current-gen remakes. Legacy and future. The White Knight Chronicles franchise gained significant momentum despite a few shortcomings. It spun into a sequel and a PSP prequel, and its trailer and early marketing shaped player hopes for what JRPGs could be. But since then, it's largely slept in the public imagination, a case study in ambition and limitations. Level 5 has pivoted to other franchises, and while WKC still has fans, there's been no major revival that directly builds on the spectacle that trailer envisioned. The future of Final Fantasy seems more open. Final Fantasy XVI has already been supported with DLC, expansions, and strong community discussion of what the next mainline entries could learn from its design, particularly in blending cinematic spectacle with emotional storytelling. It'll be very interesting to see what they do next outside of the Final Fantasy VII remakes, and now that the fanaticism around MMORPGs has mostly burnt itself out, I suspect that with the success of recent single-player titles, they will make another similar game, and with enough budget and talented developers behind it, I have high hopes that it will impress. Conclusion. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane, and I hope you don't feel like I've been unfair to this nearly 20-year-old title. It was impressive for the time, for sure, when you consider that in 2008 its contemporaries were games like Fable 2, Valkyria Chronicles, or the first Mass Effect. But I've still thought about that first trailer from time to time, and it was a strange epiphany to realise I was finally playing the game I had imagined a couple of decades later when I stepped out into the grassy fields of Rosaria. So I hope you'll give Final Fantasy XVI a go, and why not dust off a copy of White Knight Chronicles to see how it compares. If you've played both games, I'd love to hear your opinions in the comment section, and especially if you saw that first trailer for White Knight as well. How did you react, and how did it change your perception of the shipped game? Thanks very much, like and subscribe for more.